Hey everyone, welcome back to our next chapter in our continued exploration of the story by Randy Frazee. This time around, we are looking at chapter 13, which is entitled The King Who Had It All. This week's chapter, our focal point lies on the individual known as King Solomon. Now, King Solomon was David's son, the third king of the United Kingdom of Israel, and also the final king of the United Kingdom of Israel. As we hear in this chapter, really towards the end, but we do hear it, his errors, his issues lead to God removing favor, and the kingdom will divide under his son. That's a preview of next week's chapter. Most of what we find in terms of setting within the biblical narrative, it comes out of First Kings, roughly the first half of First Kings. Solomon dies actually in chapter 11 of the book of First Kings, but we don't hear about that yet. That kind of occurs in the transition we'll see into the next chapter. So really this will be the end of the focal point on Solomon, but there is definitely some more narrative that goes in within the scripture that we don't have here in the story. We also have some examples within the chapter of the Proverbs, of which are attributed to Solomon and expressions of his great wisdom. So that's a portion of our chapter. And in addition to Proverbs and, of course, this narrative out of First Kings, some sources also indicate that the book of Ecclesiastes, if you're familiar with that one, was also written by Solomon. But of course, that's disputed. We don't know if he actually wrote it or not. But that's all part of the whole situation. Something that gets glossed over in the opening narration of what we read here in the chapter is the battle for succession and on power as David is growing old. We do hear that Bathsheba, who is Solomon's mother, continues her persuasion on David to appoint Solomon, to really make it official that Solomon is going to be the heir. But what we don't hear featured in the book, but it is in the biblical narrative, is that one of David's older sons, one of Solomon's half-brothers, does attempt to seize power throughout the first couple of chapters of First Kings. So if you want to check that out, you can. That's not here in the book. But that is a good reminder that power is seductive. Transitions of power are rarely smooth. We've seen that with Saul to David. We see it now with David to Solomon. We will definitely see it in the next chapter as we move from Solomon to Rehoboam and his son, and then how things kind of fall apart there. So that's kind of just a little bit of background. The approximate timeline for what we're looking at in terms of narrative is around 960 BC to about 920 BC. Ish. Again, remember, these are always ish. We do hear within the narrative that Solomon reigns for 40 years, and it's kind of around that time frame in terms of what we hear about. Now, the three main focal points outside of the section that is Proverbs, we hear about Solomon's early reign, basically when he becomes king and starts to establish things. Then the work that he went through of building the temple, establishing the temple that David had received the plans, if you remember that from the last chapter, and then Solomon actually builds it. And then we kind of fast forward to Solomon's old age and some of the issues that came about as things went on. So early in his reign, we learn or we hear about Solomon enjoying the prosperity and the peace that David had achieved. There is definitely a contradiction in terms of David's reign compared to Solomon's reign. His was very violent and very bloody. We heard about that last time. He really established Israel as the superpower, really kind of expanding on the work that Saul had done as the first king. David really expanded on that. And then Solomon enjoyed the prosperity that David had achieved. We could even say that by this point, they are kind of becoming the empire or the superpower of the day and in the area. Now, Solomon continues to expand it. I've seen a few sources, a few maps that actually show that Solomon did expand slightly the territory that was considered the actual kingdom of Israel compared with what David had achieved. But he really expands their power and influence and wealth and all of that through alliances and through diplomacy, which is attributed, of course, to his wisdom, which is attributed as a gift from God that he asked for when God basically said, because of my love for your father David and his love for me, I'm going to give you whatever you want. And Solomon's like, make me wise so I can be a good ruler. And God's like, hey, good call. I'm going to make you really wise. And then all the other stuff kind of came about from that. And now, also, a little side note, a little bit of foreshadowing here. We also hear that there are some issues within his early reign, but more on that momentarily. As we move it then into the section about building the temple, overall, this is a good thing. God seems to bless the building of the temple and the temple itself, establishing this is where those will worship me, and God approves it and consecrates it. But then we see a little glimmer, or if we kind of read between the lines, there's a little glimmer of issue in terms of what then Solomon went and did after building the temple. We talked about this briefly last time. Solomon then builds a palace for himself at a much larger cost and extravagance and amount of time, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So makes this amazing temple, and by all rights, or by all information, it was amazing, and then made a palace that was a whole lot more. So interesting. We also hear about the way that Solomon pulled all this off with not consecrated, that's not the right word, conscripted labor, aka forced labor, aka kind of sounds like slavery, just a little bit, and that's not cool. But again, we're starting to see some cracks in the armor here already. Moving on from there, when we get into Solomon's old age, this is where the cracks really begin to show. Now, there's some cultural things that go on here that, of course, are different than we would know or practice today. But one of the real big things that comes up is the fact that Solomon had 700 wives. We also hear about like 300 concubines. That's kind of a side note, not a good one, but also there. But 700 wives of royal birth, aka Solomon made political alliances through marriage. This includes different cultures, many different cultures, which includes foreign gods, who then Solomon begins to worship. And this is really where things begin to fall apart for him in terms of God removing favor because of what Solomon chooses to do. Now, side note, the task of the kings, and this is going all the way back, who are also referred to as shepherds throughout a lot of the biblical language and stories. We hear them shepherd language used for the kings, is to guide and lead the people, and to protect the people, and to be strong for the people, and also keep them pointed towards God, which means epic fail Solomon in regards to the eventual worship of foreign gods. So that's a lot of kind of what we hear about in these different sections. Now, as I begin to wrap this up, of course, you can have your discussion about the various aspects as well. But as per usual, problematic stuff. And Solomon's got some problematic stuff. Everybody's got problematic stuff, but Solomon really does. We hear hints about his source of wealth, which includes tributes from the neighboring kingdoms, aka Israel is stronger than everyone else, so pay us tribute so that we don't take you over. If this sounds familiar, like we hear about this in other aspects of history, yeah, it does. Egypt was the one beforehand. Later on, we'll hear, of course, about the Assyrian Empire, and we'll hear about the Babylonian Empire, and sometimes we'll hear about the Persian Empire. And of course, we'll get to the Roman Empire later, and kind of all of the above. It all seems to stem from this idea of we are stronger than you. We are the empire. We are the superpower. So pay us tribute and we'll let you be. If you don't, we're going to take you over. That's kind of seems to be the situation. And that is problematic because over and over and over again, God has warned the people, remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Remember that you were oppressed in Egypt. Remember that you were oppressed by the superpower. Don't do that. And yet, that's kind of exactly what happens. Now, there's some other things we hear about as well. We hear about that Solomon imports horses and chariots, and then also turns around and sells them. Now think about this. At the time, chariots were the tanks, the battle tanks. If you had chariots and you were going up against foot soldiers, guess who's going to win? The chariots are going to win because it's a display of power. So we see that Solomon is making riches by being essentially an arms dealer. That's maybe a weird way of thinking about it, but that's essentially what's going on. And that's one way that he continues to increase his wealth, increase the power, increase the prestige of Israel by being a nation that deals in weapons of war. And that's a bit of a head scratcher, if you ask me. We also, of course, hear about the use of slave labor or the conscripted labor in his building projects. I mentioned that a moment ago. And that's not great either. Again, that's what, going way back, what Samuel warned the people about, that if you have a king, he will enslave you and force you to work. And they're all like, we don't care, let's do it. And then we see that's exactly what happens. So all of this is kind of tying into that same theme of God's warnings of don't become the new superpower, and they become the new superpower. So that's a big thing that's like, ooh, okay. So what do we do with that? And I don't necessarily have a good answer to that, but it's worth paying attention to. The other thing that I find problematic in this is, yet again, and this is cultural stuff, and that is not an excuse, but it's here, and it's always worth recognizing, is the problematic view of women that we have in and around Solomon. His countless wives and concubines are evidence that women were property. And they were used for political advantage in terms of all of the political marriages that he had, the political wives that he had, and the establishment of alliances through that. Not great in terms of what that shows. And also, of course, concubines are essentially slaves, and that's not an okay thing. And in addition, what I also don't like about this is that the countless wives and concubines are blamed for Solomon's eventual shortcomings, and I kind of wonder about that. Now, this is not to say that individuals don't have influence on one another, because of course they do, especially in relationship, even if relationships are problematic, even if those relationships are strange and don't really line up with our understanding or expectation. But of course, influence does happen there. And I don't discount that. But I find myself wondering, why do they simply blame the countless wives that Solomon has for him beginning to worship other gods? Maybe they're trying to keep his legacy strong, and so they kind of cast blame. And when I think about that, it drives me all the way back to the story of the fall in Genesis 3, when we see the blame game happen. When God comes into the garden and it's like, what did you do? And Adam blames Eve, and Eve blames the serpent, and it's just casting blame sideways. Maybe that's human nature. It probably is, but it's all things that I think about. So that's what I have. Hope that you have a great discussion on this one as we move on through this chapter.